the dying light of Byzantium. There are few moments in history when you can almost feel the world change, not gradually, not quietly, but with a sudden, sharp fracture, like a blade striking glass. One night, you're living in the world as it's always been, and by morning, that world is gone. The fall of Constantinople was one of those moments. It wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the death of an empire, an idea, a bridge between worlds, and with it, the Middle Ages took their final, gasping breath. Imagine standing on the sea walls of Constantinople at dawn. The air is heavy with salt and smoke. To your left, the Golden Horn gleams like liquid bronze. To your right, the domes and minarets of a city that's somehow both alive and dying, a relic of Rome dressed in Byzantine gold. And far beyond, across the Bosporus, a sea of tents and banners stretches to the horizon. The sound of drums, faint but relentless, carried by the wind. You would know, even without seeing them, that death was coming, because it had been coming for a very long time. A city of ghosts. By 1453, Constantinople was no longer the shining capital of a mighty empire. It was, at best, a memory, a ghost wrapped in crumbling marble. The city that once ruled the eastern Mediterranean, the fortress that had stood for 1,000 years against crusaders, Persians, and countless sieges, now barely ruled its own suburbs. Its population, once nearly 1 million, had shrunk to less than 50,000, maybe fewer. Entire districts lay in ruins. Churches stood abandoned, their mosaics chipped and fading. The once great forums were overgrown with weeds. The Theodosian walls, those mighty triple layers of stone that had repelled the world's armies, were cracked and hollow. And yet, life went on. Fishermen still cast their nets along the Golden Horn. Monks still sang their hymns in Hagia Sophia, their voices echoing in the vast, empty nave. And Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos still ruled from his modest palace, more in spirit than in power, clinging to the last thread of an empire that should have died centuries ago. The last emperor, Constantine XI, the final Byzantine emperor. His very name felt like an omen. Constantine, the name of the first emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, now worn by its last. He was not the kind of emperor the poets would have dreamed of. He wasn't a philosopher king like Marcus Aurelius, nor a cunning general like Basil II. He was, in many ways, just a tired man, dutiful, proud, and heartbreakingly aware that he had inherited a corpse of an empire. Born into a dynasty that had seen nothing but decline, Constantine spent much of his life trying to hold together fragments of what remained: the Peloponnese, a few scattered islands, and of course, the eternal city itself. When he was crowned emperor in 1449, even his coronation was a modest affair, held not in the grandeur of Hagia Sophia, but in the smaller church of St. Mary of Blaserne. There was no gold, no procession, no cheering crowds. Just a few priests, a handful of nobles, and the sound of the wind through broken windows. Still, Constantine took his crown with dignity. He would not be the emperor who abandoned the city of Constantine. If he must die, he would die defending it. The shadow of the crescent. And across the narrow strait of water, in the city of Edirne, the capital of a rising empire, a young sultan was dreaming of conquest. His name was Mehmed II, though history would remember him by another name, Mehmed the Conqueror. He was only 21 years old when he set his eyes on Constantinople, but do not be fooled by his age. This was no reckless youth. Mehmed was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed of that dangerous kind of confidence that comes from believing you're destined to reshape the world. He had studied the art of siege warfare like a man studying scripture. He spoke several languages, including Greek, a language he would soon conquer by fire. He knew that Constantinople was more than a city. It was a symbol.
the last remnant of Rome standing stubbornly in a world that had moved on. To take it would not only give him control of the Bosporus and the riches of trade between East and West, it would give him legitimacy, destiny, and immortality. And so he prepared, meticulously, obsessively, because Mehmed understood something few conquerors ever did, that the fall of Constantinople would not be won with swords alone, but with patience, engineering, and sheer psychological terror. A city surrounded. In early 1453, word began to spread through the streets of Constantinople. The Turks were coming. At first, it was only rumors, whispers carried by merchants and travelers, but soon the truth became undeniable. Caravans of soldiers began moving westward. Engineers were seen carting massive iron barrels, each large enough for a man to stand inside. And then there were the ships. Countless ships, gathering at Gallipoli, sails gleaming white against the dark sea. Inside Constantinople, fear took root. The emperor called for aid from the west, from Venice, from Genoa, from the Pope himself, and to their credit, a few answered. A small band of Genoese soldiers, led by a man named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, arrived to help. Giustiniani was a seasoned commander known for his expertise in fortifications. He brought with him around 700 men, professionals, disciplined, and well-armed. It wasn't much, but to the people of Constantinople, it was hope. Hope in the face of an army that would soon number over 80,000. The walls of Theodosius. If you've ever seen the ruins of the Theodosian walls, even today, you'd understand why Constantinople had survived for 1,000 years. They were not walls, they were mountains of stone. A triple line of defense stretching for 6.5 kilometers, studded with towers, moats, and battlements. They had repelled Huns, Avars, Arabs, Rus, Bulgarians, Crusaders, you name it. Every army that came against them had broken like waves against a cliff. And so, when Mehmed began his march toward the city, many still believed, perhaps foolishly, that the walls would hold again. After all, they always had. But the world had changed. Gunpowder had changed it.
The monster cannon. Among the many engineers Mehmed had gathered was a Hungarian named Orban, a man with a flair for invention and apparently an equally large flair for dramatics. Orban had once offered his services to the Byzantines, but they couldn't afford him. So naturally, he went to the Ottomans instead, because of course he did. Under Mehmed's patronage, Orban built something the world had never seen before. A cannon so vast, it had to be cast in sections and assembled on site. Each barrel was nearly 8 meters long, firing stone balls weighing over half a ton. It took 60 oxen to pull it and more than 200 men to move it into position. When it fired for the first time, the ground shook. The sound could be heard from miles away, as if the earth itself were roaring. It was not just a weapon. It was a message to the defenders of Constantinople. Your walls are no longer invincible. The world has moved on. The last light before the storm. By April 1453, the siege had begun. The Ottoman army encircled the city on all sides, cutting off all supply routes. The great cannon was set up near the gate of St. Romanus. Banners bearing the crescent moon fluttered in the wind, and from the sea, the Ottoman navy formed a blockade closing off the Golden Horn. Inside the city, the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled. The citizens gathered in prayer, lighting candles that flickered in the vast darkness. There were no illusions. They knew this was the end. But there was also a strange peace, a quiet resignation. After all, Constantinople had faced the apocalypse before. Maybe, just maybe, God would intervene again. And so, beneath the shadow of walls older than memory, two worlds prepared to collide. The old world, Christian, Roman,
weary, facing the new, Islamic, ambitious, unstoppable. The last echo of antiquity about to be drowned by the drums of modernity. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of an empire. It was the end of an age and the birth of another.
The siege begins. The siege of Constantinople began on the morning of April 6th, 1453. The air was cool, the sky gray, one of those pale, exhausted mornings where the world seems to hold its breath. The Ottoman army spread across the plain before the Theodosian walls like an ocean of iron. Tents of every color, red, black, green, fluttered in the breeze. Thousands of campfires sent curls of smoke into the spring sky. And above them all, the great standards of the Sultan caught the light of dawn. On the opposite side, behind the walls, the defenders of Constantinople gathered along the battlements. Priests carried icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary. Soldiers adjusted their crossbows and arquebuses, old weapons from an older world. The emperor himself rode along the ramparts, speaking to his men, reassuring them that the walls had never failed, that God would protect the city of Constantine once more. It must have been a surreal sight. One side young, loud, and vast, the other ancient, outnumbered, and heartbreakingly dignified. The numbers game. Let's talk about numbers. Because in sieges, numbers matter, and in this one, they were absurdly unbalanced. Mehmed's forces numbered somewhere around 80,000 to 100,000 men, depending on which chronicler you believe. That included 10,000 elite janissaries, the most disciplined infantry in the world, tens of thousands of auxiliary troops, cavalry, and a fleet of over 120 ships. And let's not forget the giant cannons. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine could muster perhaps 7,000 defenders, including around 2,000 foreigners, mostly Genoese and Venetians. That's it. 7,000 against 100,000. The kind of odds that make you wonder whether the defenders were brave or simply resigned. But to the Byzantines, this wasn't just a war. It was faith against fate. And faith, as it tends to do, made the impossible seem worth dying for. The first bombardment. On the afternoon of April 6th, the calm broke. The great cannon, Orban's monstrous creation, was wheeled into position near the gate of St. Romanus. It had taken days to assemble, hours to load, and an army to move. When it fired, the sound was unlike anything the world had heard before. A deep, thunderous roar that rolled across the plains and echoed through the city. Windows shattered, birds scattered from the towers. The ground itself trembled. The first stone ball smashed into the outer wall, shattering masonry, sending chunks of stone flying like shrapnel. Dust and screams filled the air. The defenders rushed to repair the damage, hauling stones, earth, and wood to plug the breach. And so it began. Each day the Ottomans fired their cannons, massive projectiles tearing into the ancient walls. Each night, the Byzantines rebuilt them, working by torchlight, singing hymns to drown out the sound of hammers. It was a grim, exhausting rhythm, destruction and repair, noise and silence, hope and despair, repeated endlessly.
The rhythm of the siege. Life inside the city took on a strange, almost monastic rhythm. By day, cannon fire. By night, prayer. The citizens grew used to the constant shaking of the ground, the groaning of walls under stress. Monks carried icons along the ramparts, sprinkling holy water over soldiers as they fired crossbows down at the enemy.
Children gathered in the streets to fetch stones for the masons. Women cooked meals for the soldiers, often little more than bread and watered wine. At night, the city would glow faintly, from candles in windows, from torches on the walls. And in the distance, the Ottoman camp glowed too, a constellation of fires beneath the stars. Two worlds staring at each other across a strip of no man's land, both waiting for the other to blink. There were moments of eerie beauty, moments that almost made you forget the horror. The reflection of moonlight on the Golden Horn, the solemn singing in Hagia Sophia, the faint laughter of soldiers sharing a final joke before dawn, the kind of beauty that only exists when people know they're living their last chapter. Giustiniani's defense. Among the defenders, one man stood out, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander who had come to help. He was everything a late medieval mercenary was supposed to be: confident, skilled, slightly arrogant, and surprisingly brave. Giustiniani took charge of the defense of the land walls, organizing the soldiers, inspecting the repairs, and directing the artillery fire from the Byzantine cannons, which, though small, were still deadly. Under his command, the city's defense became surprisingly effective. The Ottoman assaults in the first weeks failed to make any significant progress. Every breach was repaired, every attempt at storming the walls was repelled. At one point, the defenders even managed to destroy several Ottoman siege towers with flaming arrows and a well-aimed bombard. Mehmed grew frustrated. The great cannon, impressive as it was, could only fire a few times per day. It overheated easily and often cracked under its own power. So much for invincibility. And as days turned into weeks, the Sultan realized he was not just fighting walls, he was fighting time, morale, and the stubbornness of an empire that refused to die. The sea becomes a trap. If the land siege was brutal, the sea battle was complicated. The Golden Horn, that deep natural harbor on the city's north side, was protected by a massive iron chain. A literal chain stretched across the water, blocking the entrance. It was one of Constantinople's cleverest defenses, and it had worked for centuries. As long as that chain held, the Ottoman navy could not enter the harbor, meaning the northern walls of the city, much weaker than the land ones, were safe. But Mehmed was not the kind of man who accepted no as an answer, and if the ships couldn't go through the water, they would go over the land. Yes, over. Because why not? When you're 21 and trying to conquer the greatest city in the world, reason is optional.
The Great Naval Stunt. In late April, Mehmed ordered one of the most audacious feats of logistics and medieval warfare. He had his men lay down greased wooden planks over several miles of hill and forest, and then, using oxen and manpower, dragged around 70 ships out of the Bosporus, across land, and down into the Golden Horn, behind the chain. Imagine waking up in Constantinople that morning. You climb the walls, rub your tired eyes, and there in the harbor, where there should be safety, are Ottoman warships. The defenders were stunned. Giustiniani was furious. Constantine reportedly cursed aloud, not at the enemy, but at fate itself, because now there was no safe side. The city was surrounded completely, by land, by sea, by the will of a young sultan who refused to take impossible seriously. The silence before the storm. By early May, the siege entered its second month. The walls were cracked in several places, supplies were running low, the people were exhausted, and yet the city still stood. Inside Hagia Sophia, nightly processions continued. Priests led the faithful through candle-lit corridors, chanting in Greek and Latin alike. For by now, even the religious divisions between Orthodox and Catholic seemed meaningless. Desperation makes strange allies. Outside, Mehmed paced his camp restlessly. He was losing patience. Each day that passed cost him men, money, and morale. He needed a decisive blow, something that would break the defenders once and for all. And so, he ordered his final preparations. More trenches, more bombardments, a massive, coordinated assault. The city's fate would be decided in one night of fire and blood. Dreams and dread. In the last days of May, the air over Constantinople grew thick with unease. The citizens could sense it, that peculiar electric stillness before disaster. Birds flew strangely, dogs barked at nothing, and one evening a red lunar eclipse cast the city in a haunting crimson glow. Many took it as a sign, the heavens themselves mourning the fall of the Queen of Cities. The emperor prayed, the soldiers sharpened their swords, Giustiniani tightened his defenses, and in the Ottoman camp, drums began to beat louder, faster, constant, like the heartbeat of destiny itself. The stage was set, the walls were trembling, the stars watched in silence. The end of Byzantium was only days away.
The Night of Fire. It is the night of May 28, 1453. The city of Constantinople has been under siege for 53 days. The people are starving, the walls are crumbling, and the air feels wrong, like the pause before a storm. Across the Bosporus, in the Ottoman camp, every fire burns bright. Tens of thousands of soldiers kneel in prayer, their voices rising like a tide. Imams preach of holy war, of destiny, of paradise awaiting those who fall. And in his great tent, Sultan Mehmed kneels in silence. When he stands, his decision is made. At dawn, the final assault will begin. The Last Vigil. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos holds his last council. Giustiniani stands beside him, his armor dull and dented from weeks of fighting. The few remaining nobles are gathered, their faces pale in the candlelight. There are no more plans to make, no reinforcements to hope for. Constantine's words are simple, almost heartbreakingly so. My brothers, the hour has come. The enemy of our faith is upon us. Into your hands I leave my body and my soul. Fight not for me, but for your city, for your faith, and for your families. There's no cheering, no speeches, no grand illusions, just nods, tears, and the faint clink of armor. Because they all know. They've always known. The final service. That evening, as the sun sets over the Bosporus, the bells of Hagia Sophia ring out one last time. The great church, once the largest in the Christian world, fills with soldiers, priests, monks, and citizens. Greek and Latin voices mingle in prayer, a sight unthinkable just months before. Old schisms mean nothing now. The walls are falling, and God feels very far away. Candles flicker along the marble floor, icons glimmer with gold and shadow. Some people confess, some weep, some stand silent, staring up into the vast dome that has witnessed 1,000 years of history and will soon witness its end. Outside, thunder rolls, but it's not thunder, it's cannon fire. The bombardment begins again, steady and merciless, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to midnight. The calm before dawn. In the cold hours of early morning, the emperor rides along the walls for the last time. He stops at the gate of St. Romanus, where the fighting has been fiercest. He looks out at the Ottoman camp, at the flickering torches, the endless banners, the faint glow of dawn beginning to creep across the plain. He crosses himself slowly. Then he dismounts, removes his purple cloak, and hands it to an attendant. From this moment on, he is not the Emperor of Rome. He is simply Constantine, soldier of Byzantium. In the Ottoman lines, Mehmed mounts his horse. The signal is given. A single shot from the great cannon roars across the plain, and the world begins to end. The first wave. The first Ottoman wave rushes forward, irregular troops, peasants, prisoners, mercenaries, thrown against the walls to exhaust the defenders. They climb ladders, swing ropes, hurl themselves at the breaches. Arrows rain down from the battlements. Greek fire, that terrible weapon of the Byzantines, gushes from tubes, igniting men and siege towers alike. The smell of burning flesh fills the air. Screams echo through the smoke. The assault fails, but it was never meant to succeed. It was meant to tire the defenders, to stretch them thin, to drain their strength before the real attack begins. And so it does. The second wave advances, the Anatolian troops, disciplined, shouting Allahu Akbar as they surge toward the broken walls. They bring with them heavy shields, battering rams, and siege ladders. The ground shakes beneath their march. The air hums with the sound of arrows and cannonballs. Giustiniani leads his men personally, fighting like a lion. He's everywhere at once, shouting orders, directing fire, patching breaches, hurling stones. The defenders fight with desperate fury, old men, monks, even boys taking up arms. But the pressure is relentless. Every time a ladder is pushed back, two more arise. The cannon fire grows closer, the walls crumble further, and still the Byzantines hold. For an hour, then 2, then 3. But dawn is coming, and with it, the third and final wave.
The Janissaries. They are the Sultan's pride, his elite guard, his hand-picked warriors. The Janissaries move like a tide of iron, silent at first, then breaking into a roar as they charge. Their armor gleams in the early light. Their discipline is absolute. They advance through the smoke, stepping over the corpses of the fallen, their standards gleaming with crescents of gold. The defenders meet them at the breaches, fighting hand to hand in the dust and fire. Swords clash, shields splinter, men scream. Giustiniani is struck, wounded badly by a musket ball or arrow, accounts differ, and collapses. His men carry him away toward the harbor. When the defenders see him retreat, panic spreads. They think he's abandoning them. The line falters, and at that moment, fate steps in. The breach. Near the Kirko Porta, a small postern gate in the northern section of the wall, a handful of Ottoman soldiers discover that it has been left open, or broken, no one is sure. They pour through it, climbing over rubble and into the city. More follow, then more. The defenders turn to face them, but it's too late. The flood has begun. Mehmed's banner, the green flag of the Prophet, is raised atop the wall. The cry goes up, the city is taken. And in that instant, 1,000 years of history collapses into dust. The last stand of Constantine. At the gate of St. Romanus, the emperor fights on foot among his soldiers. He refuses to flee, refuses even to be recognized. He breaks his sword against the enemy's shields, draws another, and continues. Witnesses say he shouted, "The city is lost, but I live not as a king, but as a soldier." No one saw him die. Some say he fell near the gate, trampled beneath the chaos. Others say he cast off his imperial robes and disappeared into the crowd, choosing anonymity and death. Later, a body was found, decapitated, still wearing purple boots. It was said to be the emperor, but in truth, no one knows. And perhaps that's fitting. An empire that had outlived its age vanished as quietly as its last ruler. The city falls. On the sunrise of May 29, 1453, Constantinople, the queen of cities, is gone. The Ottomans pour through the streets, banners waving, trumpets blaring. The great bronze doors of Hagia Sophia are forced open. Inside, priests still sing the divine liturgy. When the soldiers enter, the singing stops. The sanctuary that once echoed with the voices of emperors now falls silent. Mehmed rides into the city by midday,
He dismounts before Hagia Sophia, steps inside, and gazes up at the vast dome. Then quietly, he orders a prayer rug to be brought. He kneels, touches his forehead to the marble floor, and recites the Shahada, the declaration of faith. Hagia Sophia becomes a mosque, and the age of Byzantium ends. The aftermath. The city burns for 3 days. Smoke rises over the Bosporus. The sky turns gray, then red, then black. The smell of ash lingers for weeks. When the fires die, the streets are littered with rubble, broken icons, and silence. The bells of Hagia Sophia never ring again. Mehmed walks through the ruins, slowly, thoughtfully. He stops at the shattered palace of the emperors, gazes at its empty halls, and murmurs softly, "What a city this was, and we have made it a ruin." It is said that he wept, and perhaps he did, because even conquerors in their quieter moments know that every victory is a funeral. And so it was over. The city that had once been Rome's heir, the jewel of Christendom, the last light of the ancient world, was gone. The torch had passed. To the Ottomans, it was the dawn of empire. To the West, it was the end of an age.
The world after. When the fires finally died, the city of Constantinople was unrecognizable. The marble avenues that once gleamed beneath the sun were strewn with debris and ash. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia, blackened by soot, reflected a dim, uncertain light. And the Bosporus, that ancient lifeline between Europe and Asia, carried the quiet hum of ships bearing away the spoils of war. The year was 1453. The city had fallen, but the story, the real story, had only just begun. Because the fall of Constantinople did not simply end the Byzantine Empire, it ended the Middle Ages. And whether they knew it or not, everyone alive that year was standing at the edge of something entirely new. The Sultan and the city. For Sultan Mehmed II, victory brought not just glory, but the weight of destiny. He entered Constantinople not as a destroyer, but as a builder. A 21-year-old who had just conquered the unconquerable now faced the daunting task of reimagining it. In the days after the siege, he gave orders that surprised many. Looting was halted. Survivors were promised safety. The city was declared the new capital of his empire, to be rebuilt, repopulated, and reborn. He renamed it Constantinia, the Ottoman version of its old name, but to the world it would come to be known by another, Istanbul. Mehmed saw himself as the heir of Rome. He styled himself Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome, and began restoring the city's ancient palaces, aqueducts, and walls. He even re-established the Patriarchate of Constantinople, allowing the Orthodox Church to survive under Ottoman rule. It was a shrewd move, pragmatic, not sentimental, for Mehmed knew that a city, to endure, must also have a soul. Under his reign, Istanbul would become a crossroads of worlds, Christian and Muslim, East and West, ancient and modern. A city reborn from ashes, though considerably less mythical and much smokier. The last echo of Rome. With Constantinople gone, the last true remnant of the Roman Empire vanished. Think about that for a moment. From Julius Caesar to Constantine XI, nearly 1,500 years of continuity erased in a single generation. But Rome's ghost lingered, in art, in law, in the very languages of Europe. And even in the Ottoman court, traces of Byzantium remained. Byzantine architects helped design new mosques. Greek scholars served as advisors.
The traditions of administration, ceremony, and scholarship, so deeply Roman in origin, quietly shaped the empire that had conquered them. History, it turns out, has a habit of recycling itself. Empires fall, but their habits survive. The shock in the West. When word of Constantinople's fall reached Europe, it hit like a thunderclap. Monks wrote of it with horror, kings with disbelief, merchants with dismay. To many, it felt like the end of the world, or at least the end of their world. The city that had guarded Christendom's eastern flank for a millennium was gone. The gateway to Asia, the Great Wall against the rising east, had fallen to the crescent, and the implications were terrifying. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade, though no one came. The kingdoms of Europe were too busy fighting each other. England and France had just exhausted themselves in the 100 Years' War. Spain was still fighting the Moors, and the Italian states were, well, being Italian. So the great Christian powers did what they often did best. They wrote about it, they mourned, and then, slowly, they adapted.
A world redirected. Because if Constantinople was closed to them, Europe would simply look elsewhere. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Portugal began seeking new routes around Africa, across the ocean, to reach the riches of India and China without passing through the now Ottoman-controlled East. In other words, the fall of Constantinople quite literally pushed Europe toward the age of exploration. Without it, Columbus might never have sailed west. Vasco da Gama might never have rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and the global map we know today might have looked very, very different. So, in a way, when the walls of Constantinople fell, the doors of the world opened. The flight of the scholars. But perhaps the most profound legacy of all came not from armies or merchants, but from refugees. As the city burned, many of Constantinople's scholars, scribes, and theologians fled westward, carrying with them ancient manuscripts, Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved for centuries in Byzantine libraries. They arrived in Italy, bringing with them the forgotten works of Plato, Aristotle, and countless others. And their arrival would ignite something extraordinary, a rebirth of art, science, and philosophy we now call the Renaissance. So yes, ironically, the end of Byzantium helped light the fuse for modern Europe. The empire that died defending the past ensured the birth of the future, because history, in all its tragic poetry, tends to balance the scales that way. The Old Faith and the New World. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, Hagia Sophia stood, transformed, not destroyed, but reborn. The cross was replaced by the crescent, the chants of priests gave way to the call to prayer, but the building itself, its dome, its marble, its soul, endured. And perhaps that's the most telling symbol of all. Civilizations change hands, religions rise and fall, banners come and go, but the great works of humanity, the ones that reach upward towards something higher, tend to survive. Even as the Middle Ages ended, something eternal remained. A world rebalanced. In the decades that followed, the Ottomans grew stronger. They pushed deeper into the Balkans, took Athens, and eventually even threatened Vienna. To the west, Europe transformed. The printing press spread ideas, art flourished, and kingdoms became nations. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Discovery, all of it flowed, in one way or another, from that single seismic event in 1453. The fall of one city rippled across centuries. The death of one empire birthed another, and the sunset over Constantinople marked the dawn of the modern world. The Middle Ages did not end with a whisper. They ended with a cannon blast, with smoke and fire and the shattering of marble, with an emperor dying at his gate and a sultan kneeling in the church of his enemy.
It ended with the kind of finality that history rarely grants, the clean break between two worlds. When the smoke cleared, the world that remained was sharper, faster, hungrier, alive with the strange energy of beginnings. And in the silence that followed, as the ashes settled and the centuries turned, one could almost hear the faint echo of a city that refused to die. Not truly. Because even today, when you walk through Istanbul, through the old streets of the Blakarne, past the crumbling walls, beneath the shadow of Hagia Sophia, you can still feel it. The pulse of Byzantium, the whisper of Rome, the heartbeat of the world as it changed forever.
Legacy of an empire. History rarely ends cleanly. It lingers, like smoke after a fire. And Constantinople's fall was no different. It didn't vanish into silence. It dissolved slowly, echoing through art, religion, and the restless conscience of a world that had lost its last great link to antiquity. The Middle Ages had ended, but Byzantium, Byzantium, never really left. It merely changed its shape. The ghost in the marble. If you visit Istanbul today, it's easy to forget how old it truly is. The modern skyline, the chaos of cars and markets, the minarets cutting into the dusk, it all feels alive, loud, present. But beneath it all, the bones of Byzantium still breathe. Walk through the hippodrome, and the air still carries the ghostly roar of chariot races. Stand under the great dome of Hagia Sophia, and you can almost hear the layered centuries whispering. Greek psalms beneath Arabic prayers, marble beneath plaster, past beneath present. The Byzantines built for eternity, and in a way, they got what they wanted. Their empire may have fallen, but its art, its architecture, its theology, they all seeped into the foundations of the modern world. Every time a dome rises above a city skyline, you can trace its ancestry back to Constantinople. Every time gold leaf catches candlelight in a church icon, that's Byzantium still shining in the dark. Faith after the fall. After 1453, Orthodox Christianity entered a new and uncertain chapter. The Patriarch of Constantinople continued his work, now under Ottoman supervision. And while the Empire of the Cross was gone, the idea of Byzantium became something sacred, something eternal. In Russia, the fall of Constantinople sparked a theological awakening. Moscow declared itself the Third Rome. The logic was simple. If Rome had fallen, and Constantinople had fallen, then the mantle of Christian empire must now rest upon Russia's shoulders. And for centuries, that idea shaped Russian identity, politics, and ambition. Meanwhile, in the West, the shock of Byzantium's fall deepened old divisions between Catholic and Orthodox, but it also stirred a strange sense of nostalgia. Europe realized, perhaps too late, what it had lost. The last remnant of Rome, the bridge between civilizations, the keeper of ancient knowledge. And so, Byzantium became a myth, a lost world suspended between heaven and earth, part history, part dream. The scholars' fire. When the city fell, its scholars fled, scattering like embers into the night. But those embers would ignite the Renaissance.
Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and linguists brought with them ancient texts that had been forgotten in the Latin West for centuries. They translated Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, not from Arabic, as had been done in the earlier Middle Ages, but from the original Greek. It was as if Europe had rediscovered its long-lost mother tongue. These ideas fueled the great intellectual rebirth that would transform everything: art, science, philosophy, even the very idea of man's place in the universe. The irony is almost poetic. The fall of one ancient world became the seed of another's awakening. It's as though Byzantium, knowing it could not survive, scattered its light before it vanished, leaving behind a trail for others to follow.
The empire of memory. And yet, there is another kind of legacy, one more fragile, more human. The legacy of memory. For centuries, exiled Greeks, Armenians, and Balkan Christians spoke of Constantinople not as a lost city, but as a sleeping one. Songs were written about its fall. Poems whispered its name like a prayer. Every Easter, in some villages, there were laments for the Queen of Cities, as though she were a beloved friend who had gone away. And every time the Ottoman sultans marched through the city's ancient gates, they too walked upon layers of memory. The Roman stones beneath their feet, the Byzantine foundations under their palaces. For all their power, they ruled over a ghost. And the ghost never left. It lived on in architecture, in language, in quiet defiance. It lived on in Greek villages where old women crossed themselves towards the east, whispering Kyrie eleison. It lived on in Orthodox churches across the Balkans where icons still glittered in candlelight. And centuries later, it would live on in the hearts of dreamers, historians, and night thinkers. Those who couldn't quite let go of the idea that something eternal had been lost in 1453. The dream of Byzantium. There is something deeply romantic, almost painfully so, about Byzantium. Maybe it's because it was always halfway between worlds, Christian yet imperial, Eastern yet Western, ancient yet enduring. A civilization that spent 1,000 years trying to be Rome, and in doing so, became something entirely its own. Artists from the Renaissance to the modern day have returned to it, drawn by its beauty and its melancholy. Yeats wrote of sailing to Byzantium, seeing it as a symbol of eternal art, a place where spirit outlives flesh. Historians, meanwhile, have argued endlessly over what it truly was: an empire of decadence or of devotion, a doomed theocracy or a luminous bridge between epochs. Maybe it was all of these things. Maybe that's the point. Byzantium was not a place that could be understood easily. It was and remains an empire of contradictions, one that refused to die quietly even when the world moved on without it. The irony of empire. There is a particular irony here, one that history seems to enjoy repeating. The Ottomans, who ended Byzantium, would themselves decline in the centuries to come. Their empire, too, would fragment, decay, and collapse. And when it did, much of its cultural memory traced straight back, not to Arabia or Persia, but to the Byzantine systems it had inherited. The conquerors had become the keepers.
And as time went on, even the sultans began to look at the Byzantine past not as the conquered foe, but as a noble ancestor. It's the same strange cycle that defines so much of human history. We destroy what came before us, only to spend centuries rebuilding its image. The long goodbye. As centuries passed, the memory of the fall blurred. The cannons of Mehmed became legend. The last stand of Constantine XI grew into myth. His death retold 1,000 different ways. Some said he died sword in hand. Others that he turned to marble, waiting to awaken when the city was free again. History became poetry. Tragedy became faith. And Constantinople, long gone as an empire, lived on as an idea. That's the strange beauty of history. Cities fall, empires crumble, but stories endure. And somewhere in that endurance, Byzantium lives. When we look back at the fall of Constantinople, we see more than just the end of an empire. We see the hinge on which the world turned, the exact moment the old world exhaled and the new world took its first breath. It is the end of the Middle Ages. It is the beginning of everything that came after. And though the walls are gone, and the city's marble now lies buried beneath centuries of stone and smoke, the spirit of Byzantium, shimmering, sorrowful, undying, still stands. Not in stone, but in memory.
The long shadow. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest tragedies. The cannons that once thundered at the Theodosian walls are now silent. The blood that once stained the streets has long since washed away, carried off by centuries of rain and tide. And yet, if you stand there today, where those ancient walls still crumble into the earth, you can feel it, that faint hum beneath your feet, the quiet residue of something colossal. Because the fall of Constantinople wasn't just a military defeat, it was the end of an age, the slow extinguishing of a 1,000-year flame, the final breath of Rome. The end that never ends. Every civilization tells itself that it will last forever. Rome believed it. Byzantium believed it. Even the Ottomans, who took the city, believed it too. But time, that quiet, merciless sculptor, eventually wears down even the mightiest marble. It doesn't destroy, it erodes. A chip here, a crack there, and before you know it, what was once an empire is a memory, a story whispered by strangers who never knew its name. The Byzantines called themselves Romans. The Ottomans called themselves Caesars. The rest of the world called them ancient. And now all of them are gone, folded neatly into the tapestry of human history, like pressed flowers between the pages of time. What we lost. We like to imagine history as progress, a straight line upward, a staircase to the future. But in truth, it's a cycle of forgetting. With every new beginning, something is left behind. And when Constantinople fell, what the world lost was not just a city, but a worldview. For 1,000 years, Byzantium had lived between two realms, the spiritual and the temporal, heaven and earth. Its art shimmered not with realism, but with reverence. Its politics were divine theater. Its emperors, flawed, frightened, human, still ruled as if touched by God. When the city fell, that world fell with it, and the modern age began, an age of exploration, of reason, of ambition, but also of disillusionment. In gaining the world, we lost something else.
the dream that faith and empire could ever coexist in peace. Maybe that's why the story of Constantinople still haunts us, because deep down, we know what it feels like to lose something irreplaceable, even if we can't name it. The Eternal City. There's an irony in all this. The city that died was called Constantinople, the city of Constantine, but its heart had always been older than that. Older than Christianity, older than Rome. Its stones had seen the ships of Athens and the banners of Persia. It had watched crusaders march through its gates and merchants fill its harbors and emperors pray beneath its domes. It had seen faiths rise and fall, kings crowned and murdered, dreams made and unmade. And through it all, it endured. Even in its destruction, it endured. Because the truth is, Constantinople never truly died. It simply became what it was always meant to be, eternal. Not in power, but in presence. Not in walls, but in words. Not an empire, but an echo. The long shadow of Byzantium. If you look carefully, Byzantium's shadow still stretches across the modern world. You can see it in the golden mosaics of Orthodox churches, in the domes of mosques, in the very concept of empire itself. You can see it in the double-headed eagle of Russia, in the ceremonial robes of the Vatican, in the architectural rhythm of the Renaissance. You can even see it in our modern obsession with legacy, our desperate need to be remembered. Byzantium, perhaps more than any empire, understood memory. It knew that to be forgotten was to die twice. So it built everything, art, law, ritual, faith, not to impress its contemporaries, but to outlast them. And in that sense, it succeeded. Because here we are 600 years later, still talking about it, still listening to the echo of its final bell.
The Emperor's Last Moment. There's a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, that Emperor Constantine XI, in his final moments, threw off his imperial robes and fought as a simple soldier. That when the Ottomans broke through the gate of St. Romanus, he disappeared into the chaos, blade in hand, name forgotten. No one ever found his body. No grave, no crown, no certainty. The Greeks say he turned to marble, that one day when the city is free again, he will awaken. It's a myth, of course, but like all myths, it says something true, that some endings are too big to accept, that we must turn them into something timeless so that we can bear them. And so the marble emperor sleeps, and through him, Byzantium dreams. The world that followed. After 1453, the world accelerated. Printing presses whirred, explorers set sail, empires arose and fell with dizzying speed. Humanity began to look outward, to the seas, to the stars, to itself. And yet, the loss of Constantinople remained like a faint bruise on the collective heart of the West. The moment when we turned away from the sacred and began chasing the infinite. It's not that one was better than the other, it's just that something changed. Something shifted in the way we saw ourselves, no longer as custodians of eternity, but as architects of progress. The world had been remade, but its shadow, Byzantium's shadow, still lingered. The silence after. So this perhaps is how the Middle Ages ended. Not with a whisper, nor a triumph, but with a rumble that rolled across the world and never quite stopped. With fire and faith and the fall of a city that had stood longer than most civilizations last. We often talk about history as if it were a story, with beginnings and endings, heroes and villains, lessons to be learned. But history doesn't end. It drifts. It hums beneath our feet.
It hides in our languages, our rituals, our art, in the small human things that refuse to disappear. And somewhere in that hum, if you listen closely, you might still hear it, the faint tolling of a Byzantium bell, the echo of 1,000 prayers whispered into the dark, the heartbeat of a world that once was. The candle. The candle that burned in Constantinople went out 6 centuries ago, but its light, that strange golden light, never truly vanished. It flickers still in the domes of cathedrals, in the pages of old books, in the human desire to preserve, to remember, to believe. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what remains. And though the city fell, the idea of it, the dream of it, endures, unbroken, unforgotten, unending. And so the Middle Ages closed their eyes. The world turned the page, and somewhere between East and West, between the sacred and the mortal, between the ruins of the past and the promise of the future, Byzantium sleeps. Not dead, just dreaming.